Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back. I hope you had a great weekend. We are not quite done with our lecture on economic voting. If you will recall, I presented the main challenge for comparativists when it comes to this area of research, and that is figuring out what triggers economic voting and what prevents it. There's a lot of agreement that it is a thing and that it does exist. It's just that the evidence is kind of sketchy. Sometimes economic voting takes place and then sometimes it doesn't. So the question then is, why does it take place sometimes and why doesn't it other times? And one strategy for figuring out why it's triggered sometimes and not other times is using comparative methods to study a small number of cases very closely to figure out what differentiates positive from negative cases. And although much of the research in this literature is statistical and works with a large number of countries, some of it works with individual countries and uses experimental methods. There's also a third way, which is to study a small number of countries and then to compare them so that you can try to understand what accounts for the differences. And so in this area, that's a useful strategy. Today, I'm going to continue to teach you how to use those. And we're actually going to walk through and work through some examples where I give you some, hypothetical alternative explanations or circumstances or causes that might become relevant. And then we can use some examples to study them together. So we will eventually make our way to the topic of sociological voting. And that sets us up for this week. But before we get there, we'll finish this by doing what I've just mentioned. If you're having trouble finding the Lieberman reading, I'll take a closer look. Maybe I forgot to upload that one, but I'll make sure that you have that. So you'll remember that I gave you two different approaches for conducting comparative research. These are the method of difference and the method of agreement. And these involve essentially comparing and contrasting cases with similar or different traits for clues as to why they differ or why they agree. And what we're doing is we're selecting cases that are very similar or very different so that we can isolate on those configurations of similarity and difference and try to figure out what the missing piece is in those cases where economic voting does take place, and then what's absent in those cases where it doesn't take place. So let's talk about this strategy and what's involved. When we use the method of difference, what we're doing is we're finding sets of very similar cases where the outcome of interest varies. And so in this case, the outcome of interest is economic voting. And typically in country level studies, as we learned last week, economic voting is measured in terms of the incumbent vote share. And typically, different economic indicators are used to try to capture some part of the economic reality that is considered to be relevant to the vote outcome in the election. And so those similarities between cases where the outcome of interest, in this case economic voting, varies, they could be social and political and economic or historical or geographic, any number or any type of similarities that might be relevant to the issue at hand, in this case, voter behavior. Maybe we're talking about a whole host of institutional and political similarities or social and economic similarities that might be relevant to economic voting. Those would be relevant and meaningful as similarities. You want to find as many of those similarities as possible. And typically, but not always, those similarities are linked to geographical proximity. So for example, Latin American countries are often studied together, as are African countries, as are European countries, Asian countries, and so on and so forth. The point is that you can figure out and do a lot of the work by selecting countries that have geographical proximity because they often also have historical and political and social and economic similarities as well. You identify the variation to be explained, and of course, in this case, we know that that is economic voting and whether or not it takes place. And so for us, as I'll show you in a minute, that means really whether or not there's a relationship between two variables, and that is the economic indicator on the one hand, and then the incumbent vote share on the other. And then once you've got this set up where you've got these similar cases with variation in the outcome, the goal is to identify in what way those cases differ. So you look at them and you examine them closely, and you look closely and you examine them simultaneously, and you look and you ask yourself, in what way do they differ? And this is an exercise in trying to pin down the key factor that could explain variation in the outcome. And so once you identify in what way they differ, they might differ in a couple ways that seem relevant. Then you engage in the more difficult work of trying to figure out, well, did these differences actually become important in explaining and driving the variation in the outcome? And that usually involves examining the cases in more detail and going inside the cases and doing more detailed work. But for our purposes, we can walk through an example and I can show you what this might look like and how we would set this up. And so here's our example using the method of difference to try to explain what triggers economic voting and what doesn't it. We begin with this relatively simple, straightforward relationship. The idea that the higher the unemployment rate, the lower the incumbent vote share. Pretty straightforward, very intuitive. This is the kind of logic that comes from the economic voting literature. The idea that these economic conditions should impact the incumbent's survival or their performance in the election. And so where unemployment is relatively high or higher, the incumbent's vote share should be lower. And what we want to do is we want to compare similar cases where such economic voting does and does not occur. And so that is, we want to find similar cases where there does appear to be a close relationship between these variables and where there doesn't appear to be a close relationship between these variables. And so in some of these cases, unemployment is high and the incumbent vote share is lower. But in other cases, unemployment may be high, but the incumbent's vote share may also be high, and there may be no discernible relationship, or there may appear to be no discernible relationship between the variables. And so now we've got then these two types of cases. We've got two very similar cases, but they go different ways. The outcome varies. And we want to figure out, well, what accounts for that variation in the outcome? You know, what else differentiates these otherwise similar cases? And we want to consider the following variables. And I generated these. I thought about what alternative hypotheses might account for the vote outcome, the electoral outcome, the incumbent's vote share, or what might impact or affect the likelihood of economic voting taking place or unemployment rate affecting the incumbent vote share. So on the one hand, maybe trade openness. If the country is very open to international trade, it might be that voters don't hold the incumbent government accountable for high unemployment. If those voters think that that high unemployment rate is due to global economic conditions affecting the domestic economy. That's one possibility. It could be that if it's a federal state, maybe voters blame the governor or even their local leaders for economic performance instead of, say, the incumbent executive or the incumbent president or prime minister's party. That's a possibility. Maybe they're blaming other actors who they hold accountable for the economic performance. I also considered the possibility that if global unemployment is very high, even if the country is not necessarily that open to trade, maybe voters won't blame the incumbent because they'll think that, well, there's a global economic crisis that's affecting everyone relatively equally, in which case they wouldn't hold the incumbent government accountable. Maybe they would blame the global economic circumstances. That's a possibility. And then maybe welfare spending. maybe even if there's a high unemployment rate, if the state and the government is spending a lot on social welfare to sort of shore up unemployed workers and support them, maybe in that case, voters don't hold the incumbent accountable. Maybe in that case, they're actually, frankly, maybe supporting the incumbent because of the government's willingness to support them socially and economically during the downturn. All of those are, I think, logical explanations for why the economic vote might not take place. Those are all things that we can test and try to figure out. And so, what we do is we examine our cases and we look at our cases and we, first of all, figure out what their values are on all those different variables. So we do the research, we find the information, and then we label each case the value on that variable. And what I've done here is I've created some generic hypothetical data. What you're looking at is made up. These are just hypothetical countries that have these different values on these variables. And what you see is you see 5 different country cases. You see the variables of trade openness, federal versus unitary state, global unemployment, welfare spending, and then the outcome, economic voting. And you see that only in one case, country 5, did economic voting take place. In all other cases, it did not take place. And I've made the country 5 blue so that we can distinguish between the positive and the negative cases. And when we do this research and collect this information and determine the value that each country takes for each variable, and we enter our information in our table, we can then ask the following questions. In what ways do these, or in what way do these similar cases differ? And then, moreover, what inferences can we draw from the data based on what we see here? In what ways they differ according to the information that we collected. So we're looking at this and we're using our method. We're using our method for clues to try to figure out clues as to why the cases differ. So when you look at this, something should pop out at you after a moment or two. And what I'd like you to do is do this silently and to yourself and kind of work through this exercise individually as if it were something that you were to do on your own. And here in a moment, we'll do this together and you can kind of cross check your responses to see how you did. And if you'd like to, you can send me your response in a direct message on the chat, okay? Right on. So some of you have already begun to send me your response. Very happy to see that. Just let them roll in through a direct message. Yes, Ashley. Yes, you're correct. As is Ishan, as is Brittany. And these are all direct messages that are rolling in. And those of you who are still thinking, we'll take a while to think on this. This is a very useful exercise because we get to figure out what this looks like and how this process works when you collect the information. And so we'll take a moment here and I'll give everyone a good chance to respond. Send me in a direct message. Good, Edna. Yeah, absolutely. That's right. A lot of consistency here in the responses. Very happy to see these responses. Absolutely. Alex and Tessa both have sent direct messages with with on point responses, as have several other students. Lots of responses rolling in here. Good, Shandon. Absolutely. So let's take a look at, we still have some responses here coming in. I always get ahead of myself. Good, Jocelyn. That's right. That's true, Josette. Yes. We could draw additional inferences too, but that one is one that you could draw without a doubt. There's a lot of inferences that we can draw from this. Uh, there's there are positive and negative inferences about what may cause it and what may not, based on just this limited information. So I think that this is very useful, and we'll do a little bit more like this here as we go forward. We'll do another one that's very similar, but uses the method of agreement. But let's take a look at what I've got here. And if you've highlighted the federal unitary state variable, that is correct. That's what I picked out as well, and what I intended for you to pick out when I created this generic hypothetical data. And what I did when I went through this and carried out this little exercise is I picked out the following. Both the positive and negative cases of economic voting were open to trade and spent a lot on social welfare. And global unemployment was high in all of those cases. So what that meant was that since both positive and negative cases were open to trade, openness to trade couldn't have caused voters to hold uh, politicians accountable or the incumbent accountable. And similarly, it was also the case that both positive and negative cases spent a lot on welfare, meaning that a failure to spend a lot on welfare couldn't have meant economic voting, or voters wouldn't have held you accountable for not spending a lot on welfare. And then finally, global unemployment was high in all of the cases. So it appears as though there wasn't accountability even in those instances where unemployment was high, and frankly we don't have any variation on that variable, so we can't say whether low unemployment would have triggered economic voting, and so maybe there's a limitation in the data in that regard. But what I also picked out was that the positive cases of economic voting differed in only one way, and that was the unitary state federal state variable. And why would that matter? Why does it matter if it's a unitary state or a federal state? Well, it has to do with accountability and who you can blame for your hardship. If it's a unitary state and there's a national government and that's it, well, it's pretty easy to blame the executive and the incumbent government for the economic downturn. But if there's a federal government, a state government, a local government, regional governments, well, then you can blame those governments too, or you can blame them and then not blame the incumbent government at the national level. It becomes easier to sort of rationalize or look the other way, or at least to blame someone else. And maybe they are to blame. But the point is, the organization of power might affect the ability for of voters to hold elected officials and governments accountable. And so that's an interesting idea that comes out in this data. And I thought that that was logical and maybe worth considering. But let's go through an example from the method of agreement. And let's use the method of agreement to do essentially the same thing, but with some different data. And so let's walk through first and foremost the strategy, the analytical, the approach, the method itself. What we're doing is we're picking out sets of very different cases where the outcome does not vary. And so that is countries that are different in as many ways as possible, but they have the outcome of interest in common. They have the same value on that variable. So we identify the outcome to be explained. In this case, it's economic voting, or it's that link between the economic indicator and the incumbent vote share that we expect to find given the theory. Third, we tried to identify what factor these different cases have in common. And that is the key factor that is related to the outcome. Now, as a reminder, these differences, they can be geographic, social, economic, political, institutional, historical, you name it. They often do relate to geography, but not necessarily or exclusively. It often is the case, as I said before, that very, very different cases might be in different regions, just as very similar cases might be in the same region, but they don't necessarily need to be. There are some important exceptions. It often and virtually always depends on, what specific variables you're looking at and what key variables you need to differentiate or have similar based upon the method that you're using. So in this case, let's go through our example using the method of agreement and using some hypothetical data that we would potentially come across if we were to do a study using these variables and using this approach. So yet again, we start with that same relationship, unemployment rate and incumbent vote share. The idea that the higher the unemployment rate, the lower the incumbent vote share should be. Whereas before we looked for cases that were similar but had variation in that outcome, now we're looking for cases that are different but that agree in that outcome. So where that link between unemployment rate and incumbent vote share does obtain, we find cases that are very, very different, but where that outcome is the same in that relationship between incumbent vote share and high unemployment rate. And so once we've got those cases, those very different cases with the same relationship, we focus again on those four characteristics: trade openness, federal unitary state, global unemployment, and welfare spending. Remember that those four variables were all interesting to consider because they all represented factors that could affect whether or not voters would hold the incumbent national government accountable for the economic performance in the last few years. So we then take a look at our data. And again, what I've done is I've highlighted the positive cases of economic voting and made them blue. And those are the cases that we're mainly focusing on again, but we also have a negative case in here that is not highlighted. But for the purposes of the method of agreement, we ask, what factor do these different cases have in common? What unites these very different cases? And what could possibly explain their shared outcome? What is it that they have in common that might explain why they all exhibit economic voting? And yet again, I'd like you to use the chat and tell me in a direct message. And moreover, also draw an inference, draw some inferences from the data. What does this data suggest is at work here? And so use the direct message to chat me directly. Brittany, Ashley, Collins, Hargis, Virginia have all messaged me already, and they're all on point. As is Edith and Edna, Chandon. Good. There's a lot of consistency here. I see that again we're picking up on the pattern. A lot of good responses. Some of you are going into a little bit of detail and kind of reflecting on what the relationship might imply, which is neat to think about why there might be a relationship between the variables that emerge here. Give you all another moment or so to sit on this. An important point that comes up here is what we're really looking for is covariance. A lot of good responses here. Very happy to see you all working through this and using the logic of the methods of agreement and difference. Let's do this together, and I'll show you my responses to this hypothetical data. Now, what I picked out was the welfare spending variable. You look at this, and the first thing that stands out is the positive cases in blue vary considerably along all three of these variables. They don't have anything in common when it comes to trade openness. They have different state structures. Uh, the the countries or the cases here are at different are at points in time where global unemployment is at different levels. And as a result of all of that, we can't actually say that any of these variables cause economic voting because we need the variable to co-vary with economic voting, right? So if economic voting takes place in all four of these cases here, well, then the factor that is explaining economic voting needs to also be present in all four cases somewhere else. And the only variable that has that is welfare spending. And you look and you see that low welfare spending, low welfare spending, low welfare spending, low welfare spending, in all four cases that are positive cases of economic voting. And then lo and behold, you look down and you find out that the one case where economic voting did not take place also had high welfare spending. And so there's covariance between welfare spending and economic voting. And the logic of this is relatively straightforward. Economic voting will be triggered when governments don't sufficiently spend on welfare, when they don't spend enough to support people given all of the unemployment. If you spend enough on welfare and you support people satisfactorily, even though there's a lot of unemployment, they probably won't vote you out of office. They'll probably keep you in office because they think that you supported them during a difficult time. But if you don't spend on welfare and you don't spend on unemployment, for example, and unemployment is very high, they're very likely to vote you out of office based on economic grounds because you didn't do anything to help them in a time of need, and they ended up blaming you for it. And so that makes sense, right? It's very straightforward. It gives you a sense of how other factors, other economic and political and social circumstances can trigger economic voting or work against it. And the responses that I got in the chat were very much consistent with that explanation. You guys got that, did a really good job picking that out. And so let's take a look at my response so that we can work this out piece by piece. So notice then that the positive cases, they differed in trade openness, federal unitary state, and global unemployment. So there's no covariation between economic voting and any of these variables. So without that covariation, we can't say that any of these variables cause economic voting. But the positive cases of economic voting were similar in one regard, and that was welfare spending. They all had low welfare spending. The negative case, by the way, where economic voting did not occur, had high welfare spending. And so that suggests that a failure to compensate people during economic downturns will cause them to vote you out on economic grounds. But if you're successful in compensating people on economic grounds during a global or a domestic downturn, they're unlikely to vote you out on economic grounds. And in fact, they might vote you or keep you in on economic grounds. And so what this suggests is that low welfare spending may trigger economic voting. And it makes sense. It makes sense. But these are the kinds of questions that we need to tease out and study in more detail to try to figure out when economic voting takes place and when it doesn't take place. And in your own research, you could answer these sorts of questions too by trying to figure out, well, what are the conditions that have to be in place for people to become economically minded when they go to the polls and to vote in this way. And so this is a neat way for us to learn both how to use methods, as well as learn about how to form hypotheses, test hypotheses, or at least explore them. And you can see that these methods can be useful ways of trying to explain difficult problems. The problem of explaining when economic voting takes place and when it doesn't take place. That's something that statistical methods aren't as good at doing because they're not capable of teasing out complexity and contextual differences and nuances that usually only come out when you compare very carefully selected cases. Before we move on, does anyone have any comments about economic voting or about when economic voting is triggered or about how to use these methods? One more thing to point out, and I'm sure this was something you noticed too. The hypothetical data I gave you before emphasized ultimately the federal unitary state variable, but this data seems to emphasize the welfare spending variable. So if that's troubling to you, it should just be cause for further research, right? We collect more information, we study more cases, we do more analysis, and this is something that you'll come across time and time again. Sometimes your expectations are confounded by new information, and we just need to do more analysis and find more information, and that's what we would do in a situation like this. So this takes us to our next issue, and this is what we're dealing with this week. And this is the question of partisanship and accountability, or partisanship in voter behavior. Partisanship is certainly an interesting and a noteworthy topic because, of all places, the United States seems to be riven with partisanship. And much of the dissatisfaction with politics in the United States is due to distress over our two-party system and the attachment that people seem to have to partisanship and the way that partisanship seems to determine vote choice and voter behavior, and how rigid and inflexible voter behavior can seem to become in light of partisanship. But as we start this discussion, what I would suggest to you is that partisanship is not as fixed and as rigid and as all determining as we might think. In fact, one of the difficult things for the literature, and one of the things that comes out of the most recent election, is the fact that voters often reevaluate their partisan leanings in their attachments, in their rationale for voting a certain way in light of party performance. And so even if they have partisanship, party performance can affect their vote. And in this regard, there's sort of an interesting marriage between economic voting and partisan voting. You'll see as we discuss this that partisanship, while it is ultimately often very fixed, it can be relatively fluid as well. And it can become consequential, that fluidity, in very important elections. This recent election was clearly an example of not just turnout, in particular on the Democratic side, but also some change in partisanship and some change in partisan association among Republicans. And so when we talk about partisanship, what we're really talking about is the sociological model of voter choice. And the sociological model privileges party attachment and party association or partisanship. And it treats partisanship as stable and determinative and relatively enduring and sort of valued for its own stake. It treats partisanship as a lens through which politics is viewed and understood, very much in the way that this image here captures, like this sort of tunnel vision idea of blue or red or whichever color might define you here in the US context. And here in the US context, where the sociological model emerged and was popularized, Partisanship was often understood as formed by outside social influences like your parents, your family members, the other people in your sociological circle, or maybe people at church if you attend church, or people in your neighborhood who you're close with and who might often share other values with you or belong to other groups that you also belong to, and so on and so forth. And for all these reasons, because of the stability of parental and family and sociological influences, partisanship was viewed as relatively enduring and stable as well. And so there often was a very kind of monolithic view from the perspective of the sociological model. And the vote was ultimately understood as determined by party attachment. What you're looking at here is the infamous funnel of causality associated with the sociological model, or the Michigan school, as it's often also referred to. And although this school of thought was very ambitious about accommodating a whole range of other factors that might sort of ultimately reinforce and influence party attachment as well, they viewed party attachment as central and as fundamentally a result of, of group and social orientations, and then party attachment as being the formative cause of the vote. Of course, outside conditions like economic conditions and media influence can play a role, but they really only partly sort of modify what's set in motion by these formative early group and familial associations. And so this is a sociological model precisely because it emphasizes the sociological, whereas economic voting views the voter as fundamentally rational, as fully informed, as capable of evaluating different alternatives based upon an assessment of costs and benefits. This is a model that views individuals as motivated by and driven by influences that are handed down to them and choices that are sort of made for them in sort of scripts and codes that they're kind of adopting and kind of acting out. It's the kind of logic of appropriateness that influences the vote, not necessarily the logic of instrumentality or rationality that influences the rational choice considerations in the economic voting model. So this is very different, right? This is sociological. It's about group loyalty. It's about group identity. It's not about rational choices. It's not about information or evaluations of benefits and costs and benefits. It's about group attachment and group loyalty. And more generally, the idea is demography is destiny. And that is to say that your group affiliation or your group association will be your destiny politically and will determine for you what choices you'll make and who you'll vote for, what you'll do when you go to the polls, whether you'll go to the polls perhaps, but ultimately your choice of party and your choice of candidate. The idea is that the groups you belong to impact your views, in that those groups are larger than you and sort of are bigger than you, and they are groups into which you fit and that you are sort of submerged in, and that you have to kind of appeal to and meet the expectations of. It's this logic of appropriateness, this logic of what's acceptable and what's not within your social group or your circle. Of course, there's a challenge to the logic, which is the simple fact that people belong to many, many different groups. And who's to say that we should value all of them equally and that one of them isn't more important than another? And scholars in this field get around this by saying that how much you identify with particular groups matters, and the strength of your attachment to particular groups matters. And so it certainly is true that everyone fits in lots of different groups, but they're going to be more associated or tied to some groups than others. And so therefore they will ultimately take cues from those groups that they're most closely tied to. This is a convenient way of dealing with what's obviously a very, very challenging issue, the question of where people get the sociological influences and where they get the sociological reasons that they vote the way they do. Even if we accept that there's a sociological reason for our vote choice, it becomes quite difficult to narrow down which influences might be the most important. One strength of the economic approach is that evaluations of one's financial situation or evaluations of the strength of the economy can be done in only so many ways. Whereas in any given person's life, there may be infinite numbers of people or groups to which you belong, and you may not even be fully conscious of the ways that they influence you or the ways that you take cues from those groups. Now, of course, we might ultimately agree that our families and that our community groups will probably be the most influential among those sociological factors. But the strength of group loyalty can also vary from person to person, and the social divisions themselves matter as well. There are differences between social groups in the strength of their attachments and their cohesiveness and so on and so forth. And so sometimes in the comparative literature, the challenge is as in economic voting, explaining the strength of partisanship in some cases and the weakness of it in others. And at this stage, I actually want to pause and I want to open it up to you all. And I want us to kind of think about and reflect on sociological and economic voting. And it's really a question between partisanship and economic considerations. And in your own experience, do you feel as though partisanship and partisan loyalty matters more than economic considerations? Or do you feel like when you vote, you're voting based on the state of the economy and you're punishing or rewarding politicians and parties? Is it partisan attachment and partisan loyalty, or is it some evaluation of the economy? What do you feel like motivates your personal choice when you go to the polls? Partisanship or the state of the economy? Hope says party attachment can lead to persuasion, I think. So the ability of the party to persuade the voter, that's an interesting point because you sort of have some pull with them already. What are some other ideas that folks have? Hope continues, says, like turning the voter away from the other party or issue due to loyalty and persuasion. Absolutely. Yeah. And the ability to appeal to that notion of established partisanship is meaningful. Aiden says, I am voting based on my current situation. If the economy is thriving and it falls in line with my partisanship, excuse me, then it is a match made in heaven. If not, then it will be more of a challenge to make my decision. One student says, as an economist, it has to be the state of the economy and understanding what certain parties will do is what affects me. Yishan says, I think that partisanship for me in the country plays a larger role in how you even see the economy. An example was after the CARES Act, how Democrats still saw the economy as failing despite the bill causing relative stability among many groups. So it could be that perceptions of the economy, maybe perceptions themselves, are influenced by partisanship. And so maybe actors or voters, as boundedly rational, only perceive the state of the economy in a way that their partisanship permits them to see it. That could be the case, certainly. What I would venture to say is that that's probably more so the case in established democracies than new ones, where partisan loyalties are probably more tenuous or less well established. Parties are often newer. And generally speaking, partisanship is probably less decisive a decision maker. Also, probably because there's usually more of an economic challenge associated with democratic consolidation. The question of how democratic or how, excuse me, how developing and developed democracies might vary in terms of partisanship and partisan voting is an interesting one. Anthony says, I'm leaning more towards partisanship where I feel like they convince me from their certain views in their ways of trying to also better the economy. So maybe your partisanship is what opens you up to certain candidates in the primary, but maybe you're ultimately voting based on partisanship. You know, it's an interesting question, right? I think that outside of the United States, there's an important question about whether the country is a new democracy or an advanced democracy. And if it's a new one, as I said, party attachments are often much weaker. Parties are newer. Partisanship may not be as decisive an ingredient. Economic voting, however, may be an important consideration. Christopher says, economics is main priority because I am an independent voter. It has to work for me, unless Bernie Sanders' subscription is partisanship. I think technically his is nonpartisanship because he is literally an independent. But listen, everybody, we're not done with partisanship and sociological voting. We're just getting started, but we will continue with this on Wednesday. We're done for today and we're out of time. So thanks everybody for being here. You're free to go. I'm going to stop the recording and we'll be on our way. Thanks so much. And I'll see you on Wednesday.
Thank you, Professor. Have a good day.
Thanks, Virginia.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Have a good day.
Thank you.